morning, everyone, and welcome to another CBI SME webinar. I'm Tom Barrett, Deputy Regional Director for the Northwest, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. And this morning we're focusing on a really important topic, sort of the employment law landscape as we're going into the winter, and we know a second wave of COVID-19 infections is on the rise, and we know particularly SMEs are going to face a tough winter ahead. So yeah, there's difficult employment decisions up ahead, so I think it's important to get some insight on this. So I'm delighted to be joined by Eugenio Migliori, Principal Policy Advisor in the CBI's Employment Policy team, Susan Rafferty, Senior Advisor at ACAS, and Adam Hartley, Head of Employment at the law firm DLA Piper. So thank you, Adam, Susan, and Eugenio for joining. And please, as we go through the webinar, do use the chat box to send through questions. We'll try to get through as many as you send through as possible. And they're also really valuable for the CBI to help gauge what particular questions, what particular topics are on your mind. So without further ado, I'll turn to you first, give the CBI's insights. So what's the CBI seeing in terms of overview of impact on the labour market at the moment?
Hi, yes, thank you. Hi, Tom. Hi, all. It is a great pleasure to be here. So yeah, definitely a very crunch time in terms of the pandemic. We saw France imposing a national lockdown last night, and cases aren't going down in the UK. So it's difficult. It's a very tough moment for all of us, but in particular for businesses. But the Chancellor's announcement last week will help, and the job support scheme and the expanded job support scheme for those businesses in Tier 2 and Tier 3 will prevent some redundancies, but not all of them. So what I wanted to share with you today is the employment trend survey that we did in August, end of August, beginning of September. But I think I think it's fair to say that when the survey was done, the overall picture of the economy was better, and businesses were more optimistic. So some restrictions were lifted, and the virus was, I suppose, sort of under control. So the numbers in this survey might not reflect the current picture for businesses. So with that caveat in mind, I'm going to share some of these figures. So we got a total of 248 responses, and it's actually very interesting to see that we got 78 of these, the total, were SMEs, whereas in previous year it was more like a 50-50 split. This year we got nearly 8 in 10 respondents from the SME community. So 46% of businesses with between 1 and 49 employees, and the remaining 32 businesses with between 50 and 249 employees. So very interesting and very reflective of the SME community. So in terms of there was a really interesting question around the size of the workforce in the next 12 months. So businesses' expectations around the size of their workforce. And we see for the SME, so I'm sharing SME figures here, not the overall figure. Nearly 1 in 3 companies are expecting their workforce to be smaller than it's today. So that is a big jump from 2019 ETS. So we've been running this survey for 20 years now. So it is a trend survey, so we tend to compare figures with the previous year. So that's a big jump from 2019. But we see that 35% of SME businesses think that their workforce will be the same as it's today. So that's kind of positive. So they're going to be sort of same size, keeping the staff they have. What we see actually is like a 2 jobs market, while some firms are already looking at creating new jobs, especially those that can offer flexibility and can offer working from home arrangements. Most others are in survival mode. So I think it's gonna be very important, and the effect of this pandemic on young people as well it's quite it's quite big and depressing. But actually, in this survey, we've seen that 1 in 10 SMEs are looking to use the Kickstart scheme that government announced in July. So actually, we're supporting businesses throughout that process. So that's actually encouraging to see that they're supporting young people. In terms of pay, it's interesting to see that 35% of SME companies are planning to implement a pay freeze in the next pay review. Again, a big jump from 2019, but still 29% of SMEs will increase pay in line with inflation. I think it's interesting to see the figures when asking about the minimum wage and the future of the minimum wage for 2021, which is a big concern for all businesses, SMEs, but larger businesses as well. And we've seen there that nearly 3 in 10 SMEs are asking the Low Pay Commission to recommend a freeze in the minimum wage for 2021, while 32% of SMEs think that the increase should be a very cautious one. So, firms are urging the Low Pay Commission to be very cautious in order to help keep more people in work. And we've been talking to the Low Pay Commission and to government, so we believe that the emergency brake on the national living wage needs to be pulled to protect jobs in the short term, while maintaining the ambitions to reach the target that the national living wage has for 2024. So that's an interesting aspect of the survey. And then the last bit I was going to share is a new question in this year's survey around steps that companies are taking to avoid redundancies. And we've seen that 45% of SMEs, so nearly 1 in 2 SMEs, are taking steps like reducing working hours. 35% of SMEs are reducing bonuses, and 24% are reducing overtime and pay premium. So we've seen businesses taking all the steps they can to protect jobs and to ensure that redundancies are the last resort. But as I said at the beginning, this survey was conducted when the economy was looking better and the prospect of a national sort of lockdown wasn't really in the agenda, where now we're seeing countries across the European Union sort of implementing national lockdowns again. The last bit, and I finish with this, Tom, is some positive bits that we've seen, and I think the one is around diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion remains high on the business agenda, and we ask whether companies' focus on D&I has changed over the last 12 months, and actually 31% of SMEs told us that they have increased their focus on D&I. So that's actually quite positive. They're trying to survive, they're keeping as many jobs as possible, but they are thinking about D&I as an important part of their business. So that is a positive bit. And then I can share more positive stuff around flexible working. Of course, more businesses expecting that to be the norm in the future, and nearly, I think, 80% of businesses expecting that to be the norm in the future. And that's quite positive, and we're seeing that for employees, but for employers as a positive stat. So I'm going to leave it there, Tom, but when we can follow up with more info in the Q&A.
Thanks, Eugenia. I think it's really useful to get that broad overview of what the employment trend survey, which we run annually as the CBI every year, and interesting you said increased SME take up this year, and always helpful to try and remain positive. So thank you for even silver linings in the cloud. Susan from ACAS, I'll turn to you next. Does that sort of match what ACAS is finding at the moment on how employers are responding to the crisis, and particularly in the context of when it comes to their staff?
Absolutely, and in fact, it's interesting. I was going to talk about some ACAS research that we carried out a few weeks ago that actually very much chimes with similar figures, although I think it's probably done slightly more recently than yours, but actually similar. So we found 6 out of 10 large businesses said they're likely to make redundancies in the next 3 months. More concerning for us from a good practice point of view is the fact that 1 in 4 bosses were unaware of the law around consultation before redundancies. And actually in SMEs, so businesses with fewer than 50 workers, that went up to 1 in 3. So there is some lack of knowledge around for employers about what to do. Now, there are very clear legal requirements around large-scale redundancies, so over 20 employees, but even smaller employers need to consult their staff. And I think what's happened is some employers have forgotten the rules effectively and haven't been thinking about things like their furloughed staff and their remote staff and the need to consult with them. And as I say, although legally there's a requirement, it's also incredibly important to do it as early as possible, because employees can come up with really good solutions to try and avoid redundancies. I thought it was interesting when Eugenia was mentioning about a lot of employers looking at alternatives, so job cuts, hour cuts, reduction in pay, job sharing, revamping their job roles. Again, always talking to staff is incredibly important. And of course, we will come out of this at some point. So you need staff who feel that they've been engaged, that they've been trusted, that it's been communicated. I mentioned about remote staff and staff on furlough, and this I think is giving us some additional concerns around the consultation. And I think there are things that people aren't really focusing on, particularly, for example, staff who are working from home who might be sharing a workspace with partners, with flatmates, and thinking about the fact that actually just, for example, arranging a Zoom call to say, I'm sorry, we're going to make you redundant, might be extremely difficult. They may have other challenges, and it could be very emotive for somebody to be told they're losing their job, especially if there are other people around. So thinking about when we deliver that really difficult news and how we deliver it, and whether or not video conferencing is the best way to do it. Some people's technology is not great. Some people are very uncomfortable on it. It might be that you do it by way of a phone call. If, depending on the guidance of the social distancing and what tier you're in, could you do it face to face? And also thinking about the support that those employees have, because normally in the workplace, if they're told they're being made redundant, depending on the size of the organisation, they'll have trade union reps, they'll have health and safety, they'll have HR reps, they'll have colleagues they can talk to. But that might be very different if they are, for example, sitting in a flat on their own, and if they've been furloughed, do they actually have any way of contacting anybody in the workplace to talk it through? Do they have an email address for their HR manager? Do they have a phone number for their colleagues? So it's thinking about the support that you can put in place. And I do know some organisations that have got the equivalent of buddies for their staff, or a support, somebody that they can speak to who's been trained. So if they do have concerns or are anxious about what's happening, or simply an explanation about what it means for them, because although to people explain it, people don't always hear it. I think it's also worth, from an employer's point of view, thinking about who is delivering the message, because it's tough for managers as well at the moment, and thinking about, have they had the proper training? What if the manager is sitting at home having to speak to 3 or 4, half a dozen people about the fact they're being made redundant? What support is that manager getting? And is there some sort of support that, again, you can set up for them? Have they been trained to deliver that bad news? Because it is, again, it can be tough for them as well, especially if it's a good, well-run team. The manager will feel that this is their fault, even though it's not. So I think it's really important to think about all those underlying support mechanisms that organisations can put in place. As I say, it can be something as simple as a phone number or an email address for people, because as I say, we will come out of this at some point, and trying to end on a bit more positive note as well, is that I think there's a real opportunity for businesses if they engage with their staff at the moment, if they communicate with their staff at the moment, that's going to pay dividends going forward as and when we need to keep those staff engaged and productive as we come out of the pandemic.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I think that stat you said, around a third of SMEs not knowing the legal process and the consultation, is, you know, quite concerning. But, you know, we need to do something about this, and hopefully everybody who doesn't know can then come to someone like ACAS, but then also sometimes take legal advice as well. And then Adam, that segues neatly onto you, sort of from a legal perspective. Susan already outlined some of the tips of the when, the how, the who, but what challenges are you particularly seeing at the moment for firms who unfortunately are having to make redundancies?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting, I think I agree with my colleagues here on the call, it's been an interesting 6-9 months of complete change, of quick and different changes occurring all the time, and it has been very uncertain for everyone in terms of what is happening when. The various government job retention schemes coming to the fore, especially on a Friday evening, getting details of those and trying to predict what the details were, getting updates maybe 2 weeks later, realizing that actually you were supposed to have gone and got consent for everyone to have gone to be furloughed at home. The terminology of furlough, I mean, until probably beginning of March, I mean, most of us had never really come across the term furlough. Furlough, really very much a US terminology that we suddenly had to adapt. Also dusting off contracts of employment and seeing if we've got rights to be able to lay off staff in those contracts of employment. Touching upon redundancies, you know, like your teams and everyone else has experienced and companies have experienced, most people haven't dealt with redundancies in any sort of numbers at all for at least 10+ years. So I look at it, and my personal experience of the last 6 to 9 months has been similar to both of yourselves in terms of the surveys your firms have produced. So we've gone from complete emergency advice in terms of people being placed on furlough and dealing with the whole concept of people being sent home, then working out how to communicate with those people while they're still at home, then dealing with the second stages of companies realizing that actually they fall into the bracket of a company that actually was in trouble before this. And so we've seen themes where companies actually had, you know, completely and utterly strategic problems in the first place and therefore needed to make change. We've had companies then that have seen this as a complete shock, unprepared, no cash flow, and therefore in a desperate situation to reduce costs as best they can, whether that cost reductions have been trying to agree with people to take pay cuts, trying to put people on furlough, or alternatively, in the worst case, having to make people redundant. And we've also then seen the redundancies come in phases, and the redundancy phases have been very much, to start with, people in a state of shock, didn't realize that this was going to be here with us for a long period of time, and how to manage around that. If I look at it from a DLA point of view, we're one of the largest firms in the world, and you know, we suddenly all had to work from home. No, we can work from home, and I find the whole current tier system interesting in terms of those areas that are being put into tier 3, and normally those areas where people actually have to physically go to work. Versus, you can see at the moment, London is seeing less infections on the basis that, in my view, because most people are working from home and therefore there's less interaction. So we've gone from the redundancies position and dealing with the redundancies to then people, at least over the summer, returning a little bit more to normal. And we're doing a lot of advice at that stage about returning to the office and how to ensure that actually, if you did return to the office, you ensured that you put in a safe system of work, you complied with the health and safety requirements in order to put that in. We as a firm in September were about to get back to about 50% back into our offices. Lo and behold, Boris has done another lovely announcement from Boris, meant that we're then back to square one and we're all working at home again. And it's been interesting interacting with the team. You know, so communication, as Susan I think was mentioning, but communications just on a normal day-to-day is quite interesting, quite difficult. You know, I'm sure we've all been hit with Zoom calls back to back all day, which, whilst we all are great at trying to look interested on the Zoom call and not do any work, then end up with a longer day because we end up with a day job to catch up. So there's some mental health issues there. Also, there's no break in terms of starting and stopping your day. So the whole work pattern has changed. Also, how you ensure that your teams are not skiving off has been an interesting dynamic. We've also had people who have seen the beginning of the furlough as an opportunity to work from home. Working from home in those cases may be Bulgaria, France, Poland, Spain, Italy. They may have gone back to where they're originally from. And that's fine from an employment point of view, but then causes organisations some massive tax issues because suddenly they're operating through a different jurisdiction and being required to pay people, or those salaries being subject to tax, and potential for them to be subject to be a new, setting up a new corporate permanent establishment in their particular country. So we're seeing those issues. In terms of the redundancies, redundancies have been interesting, and just to summarise the process, just so everyone's clear, and then I'll come back to some observations which I think cover a couple of points that Susan was mentioning before the call started in terms of the wave of tribunal claims, or the lack of wave of tribunal claims, and I'll explain why we haven't seen those come through yet. But in terms of redundancies, just as an overview for redundancies, so if you are looking to make people redundant, and the number of people you are looking to make redundant is less than 20 at a particular location, then if you're making people redundant with under 20 at a particular location, then the redundancy time period really you've got to go through is probably going to take you a week to 2 weeks in terms of the consultation. And there's 3 requirements when you're looking to make an employee redundant when there's less than 20 people. And those 3 elements are consultation, as Susan was correctly pointing out, and the need to consult. And the consultation can't be, and again, I think Susan was hinting at this, quite a lot of organisations are calling people up and saying you are redundant at the first meeting. Unfortunately, the process is very clear. If someone has unfair dismissal rights, which they have after 2 years service, then the consultation has to be really clear. The consultation has to be with a view at putting someone at risk at the initial meeting. So the initial meeting is very much, we're thinking of cutting cost, we're thinking of restructuring our business. Unfortunately, your job may be at risk. That is the sort of, that's all you need to do at the first sort of meeting. And then the first meeting, they go away, they have an opportunity to think about those ideas. And then you have a second meeting, and the second meeting, you then receive their input and their thoughts. And as Susan points out, they may come back with some great ideas. You know, they may come back as a workforce and say, okay, we prefer not to make redundancies. We're all prepared to take a 20% pay cut, because they may have all got together on WhatsApp or some sort of social media and agreed among themselves that that's going to be a better way than Joe Bloggs leaving the business by reason of redundancy. So again, you see some creative ideas come. But if they've got no creative ideas, then unfortunately you'll confirm at the second meeting they're potentially at risk of redundancy and will be made redundant if there's no alternatives. And then you do a third meeting and look for any alternative positions before confirming they're redundant. Clearly, if it's a small organisation, there's unlikely to be any opportunity of alternative employment, but it's a process that you have to go through. So that first element is consultation. The second element is selection. And I think Susan, I can't remember who was pointing out at the beginning, but selection of those employees, even if the employees you're looking to make redundant have less than 2 years service, if you're selecting them because, well, you know, Joe's had a good innings, they've been here 20 years, we'll let them go. Well, Joe might be the oldest, and the reason you're getting rid of Joe may be because of his age, or the fact he hasn't got enough energy to do the job anymore, or the fact that he's male or female. Now again, discrimination issues pick in when you come into selection. So you have to be able to objectively select the individual. So the first element is consultation. The second element that we've got to go through in terms of a fair process is to make sure we select people fairly and not on a discriminatory basis. And discrimination, whilst it looks at 4 main heads of damage or heads of claim, which is race, sex, disability and age, those aspects of discrimination are extremely wide. We've had case law where eco-warriors have been held to have a religious belief. So again, you have to be very careful as to why you are selecting people. In the old days, we used to select people on the basis of the last in, first out. Now, again, that's potentially indirectly age discriminatory. We used to also select people on the basis they've been away for a lot, they've been ill, or they've had a pattern of illness, or they don't like coming in on a Friday and calling in ill. So again, people would use, when they're selecting people, they would use illness as an issue. Again, that would potentially result in an individual having a disability discrimination claim. So whenever you're looking at your selection criteria, when you're looking at selection groups, then you have to be very careful and conscious of discrimination legislation. The third element, in terms of making sure that you make someone redundant fairly, is to look for alternative employment and considering alternative employment within your group. So those are three key cornerstones of making an employee redundant. The time period to make someone redundant, the quickest you can probably do it is a week, and realistically it's probably 2 weeks. There's nothing prescribed in relation to it, but best practice probably would say that a week is a minimum. And again, taking Susan's point, the human side of it, these are people you're dealing with, these are people's lives. Some of these people may be at home and you're telling them they're redundant, and we've seen various social media posts from individuals. There was one, I think, last week or the week before, 51-year-old man, help, he said on his Twitter account. I think he got 350,000 people responding because he was very depressed. He had been made redundant 6 months ago. He had no one to talk to. He was really feeling down and really, really low. And again, through social media, people responded. But again, the approach to consultation and the human side of it is very important. If you're a larger organisation, you're looking to make people redundant, then you've got to keep a list or a running total of how many people you're dismissing within a 90-day window. And as soon as you're looking or potentially going to look to dismiss 20 or more within a 90-day window, then you have to collectively consult, which as a result, you then would mean that you either have to consult with a union if a union is recognised for those employees, or alternatively, you'd have to elect employee reps. And then you have to consult with those employee reps once they've been elected for at least a 30-day period. And if it's 100 or more people you're making to look redundant, then it's a 45-day period. And if you don't correctly consult with those and comply with those time periods, then there's a protective award, which is equivalent of a fine, really, of 90 days pay if you breach that. And you also have to make sure you submit your HR1 form, which is a government body form which allows the government and the local job centres to understand that a number of redundancies are going to occur, but it's a criminal offence if you don't put in your HR1 form. And some organisations recently have had criminal prosecutions taken against them for not submitting an HR1 and trying to avoid complying with the collective redundancy consultation requirements. I think it's been interesting as well watching the different sectors. So I appreciate small, medium-sized businesses, depending on which sector they're in, will be affected differently. If I look at the situation of, say, the technology sector, generally the technology sector, most organisations have remained quite buoyant. They've had to learn to sell in a different way. So selling via Zoom rather than selling via personal meetings has led to challenges. But technology businesses generally have been or remain buoyant. Financial services, relatively buoyant. Clearly, hospitality and leisure, an absolutely difficult sector to be in at the moment and really struggling. So we've seen differences in sectors. I think we've also seen, I appreciate the points made in terms of the CBI survey at the beginning. We've seen that a lot of clients also, following the Black Lives Matter movement, looking at diversity in a different way, trying to ensure that they can have some sort of diversity data internally. And increasingly, we're getting lots of organisations asking us how we can introduce positive discrimination, so that actually, if we get to a position where we've looked to hire someone, we've got 2 candidates, one's male, one's female, we decide we'd like to hire a female candidate to ensure we have a greater, more diverse workforce. That's great, but you would still have to be able to justify why you're therefore potentially positively discriminating against one candidate versus the other. So again, at the moment, positive discrimination is in breach of our discrimination legislation. Whether post-Brexit it will change, we don't know. One of the topics which seems to have disappeared as a topic of discussion to some great extent has been Brexit, and the impact Brexit may or may not have on employment. But again, we'll wait and see what, if any, changes occur as a result of that. I'm not going to go down that route today.
You've stolen one of my plugs at the end about the about what the
Sorry,
CBI is doing on SME and Brexit. So
I'll go back to the point Susan made. But I think the other point that I think has been interesting, and I think Susan, I think you mentioned it before we started the call, was in relation to what's happened with employment tribunals. And at the moment, we haven't seen a huge avalanche yet of employment tribunal claims. And we've also seen a change in the landscape because roughly 50% of the workforce at various points over the last few months have been placed on furlough. The number of employee relations issues has clearly declined. We haven't got staff getting into fights or having affairs or causing issues in the workplace. We've also seen less issues around performance, more challenges about how to measure performance, but all those employee relations issues have clearly disappeared significantly because of the fact that most people have been either working at home or alternatively being furloughed. And in terms of employment tribunal claims, again, point I think Susan made before the call was, the employment tribunal system itself, most of their staff ended up being furloughed. So what I've always envisaged when I've been budgeting, within my team at DLA is, yes, the initial advice was furlough, then redundancies, and then we predict that September, October onwards, we start to see the employment tribunal claims come through. So just because you haven't seen any papers arriving on your desk doesn't mean they're not going to arrive. And the other slight problem for people is that those papers sometimes are being served into their offices or their registered offices, and no one's been in the office, so therefore no one's picked up the post. So worth checking on that.
A lot of issues. So yeah, thank you, and thank you for actually giving the run through of the redundancy. What the legal steps employers have to go through, because as Susan said, and Eugenio, the stats there show that we need to increase this knowledge and things. But I think the how as well, which Susan, you particularly touched upon, and we've had a question in the chat around almost, and this is what I'll quote, that we had one through on the chat. It says, I suspect a lot of employers will take the easiest route to make redundancies to avoid face-to-face. So particularly Susan, Adam, what do you think on best practice for employers at the moment of the how? Usually you would want to sit down and do this in person, but your office might not be open, and Susan, you touched upon the problems with doing it over video. So almost some best practice. So Susan, I'll come to you first, and then Adam, get your thoughts.
I mean, there are problems with video. I think I would encourage that if at all possible. I mean, I think some of us are depressed, old enough to remember. I think the last round of big redundancies in 2008, the text message was not uncommon. So it's trying to think about the best way. As I say, can you do it video screen? Do you have COVID secure offices? So even if there's nobody in, if there's just going to be you and one other person, then trying to think about doing that. I wouldn't suggest for something like this, meeting in a coffee shop, because it's too emotive, too confidential. So it is very much trying to encourage people. What we found is that initially people were very reluctant to have the camera on if they're working from home, because, well, you can see my washing hanging out or whatever. So explaining to people things like, actually, you can put a virtual background on, can make people more comfortable. So you can't see my washing, you can't see my dog or my partner or my child. But again, it's trying to ensure that it's something that the employee is comfortable with and that the manager's comfortable with as well. As I say, video is okay, telephone maybe, or is there some way we can find of doing it securely in a secure environment? But it's trying to put the employee at ease and the manager at ease as well.
Yeah, Adam, from the way you're advising or working with your clients on who are having to go through this difficult process on the how, like the best practice on the how.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some big restructures large-scale structures where we've had to elect employee reps and go through that process. And again, we've done the process best we can through video, especially, you know, in various areas. The encouragement, if you're in an office based, is to work at home. It's difficult to then suddenly say to someone, okay, you now need to come into the office. Why am I coming into the office? At which point you end up getting into a confirmation that they're redundant just by trying to persuade them to have a meeting in an office. And I appreciate it's inhuman and it's not very nice to have to do it by video or by telephone. My preference at the moment, if we can do it by video, do it by video. Try and support the individual when you're actually confirming. So when I outlined the process earlier in terms of the initial at-risk meeting, the second meeting where you may confirm they're redundant, employees have a right to attend that meeting where they're going to be told they're redundant with a fellow employee or a trade union member. And I appreciate most organisations won't recognise a union, but the law prescribes that you've got to give them that option. But at least that also then means that if you're doing a video call, you can have their representative on the call if they've decided to have a representative. So at least that representative can hopefully speak to the individual after the call just to check they're all right. And, you know, I appreciate it's pretty brutal at the moment, and people's opportunities, you know, to find another job is really difficult. We've seen, again, my example of the 51-year-old basically calling out for help is one issue. I've seen people who have been on stations handing out CVs, you know, desperate to get jobs. You know, people are, you know, aware that depending on what sector they're in, that actually being made redundant at this time could be pretty leave them out of work for a long time. Yeah. So the human side and following up, I think even, yes, the manager's got through that awful meeting of having to confirm, because the manager hates doing it generally as much as the employee hates receiving it. But once you've got through the meeting, for someone to at least double check on the individual in a couple of days' time that they're okay, I think is a nice human side of it. No legal requirement, but just it's a, you know what, yeah. I mean, we've seen, you know, clearly an increase of people taking their lives at the moment, and therefore, you know, people's mental health and ensuring that, you know, you look after people and treat them as though they're a family member to an extent. It's the best you can do.
No,
I think it sends.
You go, Susan.
I was going to say it sends a good message to all your other staff. Actually, we're a caring organisation. Yeah. We're a good organisation. We don't just throw them away. We do support them and follow up. Again, you know, you want this for your staff going forward, because you're going to have bear in mind your surviving staff. So the people who are still there, how do they feel? Because they're looking and seeing that their colleagues are gone. So it sends a really good message to them as well.
I think you both made that point earlier on, actually, very, very well, was the point about, you know what, we will come to a point where we get through this and we will have to operate again. What that new normal will be interesting, but you know, you're going to need a workforce, you're going to need a workforce that's engaged. You're going to need to be more flexible, I think, in terms of your ability to be able to have people in the office or not. And, you know, I was in London last week, you know, and it's as though it's a Sunday in London, the city of London at the moment, it's dead. And, you know, I would expect we'll see London busy Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, maybe less busy on a Monday and a Friday. And whether it's as radical as the Barclays CEO suggested, that why has he got this Canary Wharf tower with 70,000 square feet or whatever it was, probably square meters to be honest, but why he's got this massive tower block in the middle of London when everyone can work from home is a question they've got. And organisations, you know, who have got up for rental renewals are really considering whether to go ahead or not. So big changes.
No, definitely so. Henny, if I can come back to you from the CBI, we've in the course of the conversation we've touched upon a lot: diversity and inclusion, the future of, you know, how you're going to work in the workplace, and remote working, Brexit as well. So, is there anything in the Employment Trend Survey that sort of SMEs are looking to going forward? What are the challenges or what's on their mind?
Yeah, so a couple of things, Tom, actually, because we did include a question around employee engagement and how that has changed in light of the pandemic. So actually, pretty much sort of reflecting what Adam and Susan said, but I think it's actually quite positive to see that 77% of SMEs have increased communication to keep in touch with their staff. in light of the pandemic, and 60% of companies, SMEs companies, increased flexible working arrangements to prioritize staff's work-life balance. And I think it's actually very, very good to see that nearly half of SMEs have increased their mental health and well-being assistance, and 40% have increased remote learning opportunities for staff working from home, but also those on furlough. So those were kind of positive bits that we saw for SMEs and also big companies. And in terms of priorities for 2021, and this is consistent for SMEs, but also for big companies, it's that more than half of SMEs are thinking about business restructuring, business transformation for 2021, and that means a lot of things. It could mean, you know, the way you adapt the new normal, and what Adam was sort of saying there about hybrid model of working, with people going to the office a couple of days a week and then working from home. So that kind of sort of restructuring there, but also the fact that you know, there are SMEs that will need fewer staff in the future because, yeah, Brexit conditions, lower demand, social distancing measures being within us for the next at least 6 months. So, you know, that could mean kind of negative stuff and positive stuff as well in terms of well-being and the way we work in the future. But yeah, more than half of businesses are thinking about restructuring their business in 2021. So I think that's, yeah, and that's, you know, a big jump from previous years, really. You know, they are sort of thinking about how they are going to adapt to this new normal, this new life in 2021.
Yeah, I think what's come through loud and clear from today's conversation is the number of people issues, as well as getting through the crisis and managing the remote workforce and trying to figure out furlough and the job support scheme and redundancy if you need to make them. There's actually a lot broader issues around the future and people. And, you know, SMEs don't have usually large HR teams with multiple people who can deal with this full time. So I can imagine it's really, really tough. But thank you all so much for the time. Adam, you want to make a very quick point? Just very, you got 1 minute. Oh, you're on me.
Oh, sorry.
There you are.
Nope.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to wrap up there. But thank you all sorry, Adam. Thank you so much for your time. And actually on that, so in 2 weeks' time, the next SME webinar is in 12th of November is going to be specifically on employees' mental health. And we touched on Brexit as well. We're doing an SME member discussion on the 18th of November on Brexit. So lots going on. But finally, thank you. I'd like to thank Eugenia, Susan, and Adam for their time. So thank you all.